So, all right. So today we will do a bunch of stuff. So I've opened a few tabs of the things I want to review first. So I don't know what order is the best. So I just open them in whatever order I saw fit. So people on the call for the example load context one or the dependency resolver one, which order would you prefer?
It doesn't matter.
Okay, then let's talk about.
I guess this one is the most contentious one, so we should probably last.
All right, then maybe start with the less contentious one.
No, not that one.
Well, aren't they all like the same? Like there's one here that's basically just one resolving unmanaged DLL thing, which I think. Did you not look at this one at all?
I think that's a spin-off from the large one.
So, Rube, were you saying something?
No, I said this one we haven't looked at yet. It's the other one where we looked at a bunch of them and approved them. And it was just one more API that we said we'll look at in the next meeting. So this one we haven't looked at yet.
I see. But like we haven't, I mean, didn't we have another one already? Let me just front my mouse. There was this one.
The next one.
Isn't it related to topics, the native library loader API?
Yeah, it's 32015.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the overall one, right? And I think we.
Yeah. Then there's this context proposed API. There's one more API remaining.
I see. And so this one is just the spin-off of this one, right?
Right.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So the only.
So if you want, I can provide context on this one, and can maybe because this is kind of isolated thing, we can probably decide on it right away.
Yeah, so I think last time we talked about this, the only. Let me actually find No, I did not.
I'm pretty sure we didn't talk about this one yet. This is different than the one which Swaroop was mentioning.
Yeah. The event we haven't talked about yet, the other one that says callback, we briefly talked about it and said we'll discuss it next.
Yeah, I think like the only thing I remember is like I think we talked about this at some point at least. I remember having a conversation. Maybe it was a different API, but it was the same pattern where somebody effectively proposed a callback with a func. So usually we don't do that. Usually we create a type for that because it's easier to actually name parameters, for example, right? Otherwise it's just parameter 1, 2, 3, right? You have no naming for those things. So in this case, it might actually be better to just have a delegate that actually has the named parameter spelled out. So for instance, is the first argument the path or is it just the name, right? Like you just don't know. Like you just have to basically read the documentation, register DLL, import resolver, which is not really where you want to read this because it's not friendly in IntelliSense, right? That would be my only feedback, I think.
I mean, our guidelines, our events use event handlers and the event pattern.
Yeah, that's the other thing. It's like it seems a bit odd to have a register but no unregister mechanism.
If it looks like this, it has one because event has a minus.
Yeah. Plus, in this one, you could pass in null pointer and then it is unregistered. Or I can add an unregistered API, it doesn't matter.
Oh, sorry.
But in this discussion, there's like a lot of discussion about whether it has to be events or callbacks. And ultimately, we decided on callback because we don't want multiple events on this one because there's no real use case for it and could make things complicated. There are already.
Swaroop, aren't you like confusing this the one which is shown on the screen with the other one?
Yeah.
Because the one which is shown on the screen, there's a good reason for this to be event because the assembly load context already has events. It has a very similar event like this one for managed dependencies, and so this is basically just kind of completing the API by adding an unmanaged one as well.
Right.
Correct. Yeah. Sorry, I got confused. Thank you.
And we chose the func because it's copying what we've done for the managed one, but I mean, that's easy to change. We can do delegate here, no problem.
I actually showed another version of this API down that uses a different convention, but I picked this particular thunk notation because there is another event that just says resolving for managed event, so it's just exactly the same syntax. If we go down to the rationale, I've actually have links to the API that's already exists on assembly load context.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think I'm just looking at this. So we already approved for core 2 of the API that is resolving that takes a func. So it seems that in this case we should just also stick to the func because that's the pattern we already have on this type. Makes more sense.
I mean, it is weird to have A, an event that isn't using an event handler, B, having an event handler or even an event callback that is returning something because they don't compose well.
Yeah, that's the other problem, right? Like, how do you do with that? But yeah.
But if that's what we already did on that type, then
I guess it will be the first one that returns non-null, I guess.
Yes, that's exactly how it's implemented for the one which is already there.
okay.
There's an event which is called resolving, which does the same thing for managed dependencies. And it works exactly that way, that it does return an assembly, and the first one which returns non-null stops the processing.
Yeah, it seems fine to me. I mean, like the only downside, if you will, with all these patterns is you can never really extend it, right? The nice thing with events where you have an event arcs, you can just add another property to the event arcs, and then you can pretty much deal with that. But yes, it is never super clean. But okay, that's the pattern we have. Any concerns then from anybody else? Otherwise, I would just call it a day.
I mean, your website's slow.
You need to control R again. I think one of the nodes probably just killed itself. But yes.
Yeah, so it looks like the two events on assembly load context both use, one uses func, the other uses action.
Yeah, and they're both shipped already.
So this is consistently inconsistent.
Yeah, I think that's why I remember the discussion, because I think we talked about this the last time. I don't remember why we landed on the action func pattern, but we clearly did. All right, so then this goes from this one to this one, and then this one is done. All right, one down. And then this one is effectively also done now, right? Because we just...
I mean...
This is a completely different thing. Like, it's about native libraries, but it's a completely different API. So.
No, I know, but like, didn't we... Oh, sorry, this is... Oh, I remember this now. Yeah, now I know, it makes sense. Sorry, I confused this. I thought for some reason it's the same type, but yes. I think already was proposed on the other type. I think that's why we landed here.
Yeah. I think last time you just changed the name.
Yeah.
It was called some long name, and you changed it to changes to this register DLL import resolver, and then we just left it at that.
So what were the open issues here? Like, I'm pretty sure this was more or less the shape we discussed last time, and I don't see any response from me on this one here. But like exactly.
So the proposal is to add one other API, and I don't think we decided where we would add it, like which class. You see the last one there. That's the one which the discussion is about now.
I see. So this one is effectively the logical equivalent of the API we just approved, right? Is that fair?
Yeah. There are actually two differences, though. One is it happens at a different place, and it happens at different granularity. Like, this is like a per assembly resolver, and it happens early, and the other one happens late. That's the only difference.
Yeah.
One of them takes the DLL import search path, and the other doesn't.
Yeah. This one is effectively global, right? The other one is effectively relative to some other assembly.
This one is per assembly. The other one was per assembly load context.
Oh, sorry, per load context, yes. Yes.
So I think the open questions here are, where do we put it? Like, which class?
Suppose that we put it on Marshall.
Okay.
The only thing that is weird is having a register with no unregister, but I guess that's just the way it is.
Yeah. I mean, we could add a unregister, it's not a big deal, or just call register with the null pointer.
Yeah, so this is per assembly, right? So you can, so basically you would have to register it per assembly. Is that fair?
Correct. You have to register per assembly.
Yeah, so you can basically say if you pass a null, then it's effectively unregistered, right?
Is registering a resolver setting the resolver or adding it to a chain?
It's setting the resolver. We're saying that only one can be set for assembly.
Yeah.
I wrote it in the documentation.
Instead of register.
I think that's fair.
Because register, I expect it means you're adding it to a chain, which is why we'd expect an unregister. But if there's only ever one, that's the verb there is set.
And then null makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe that's fair.
Do we want to make it a delegate in this case, since there's no like existing thing to be aligned with?
I mean, the func notation sort of sets exactly like low library, try low library pattern. But if we want to have a name delegate, that is fine with me.
I personally would like the delegate because, as Ima said, IntelliSense gets way better with it.
Yeah, and you have documentation you can put on stuff. That's generally, and you're already into about namespaces where it's already a grab back, so you're not polluting a namespace anyway. So I would honestly say make it a callback. I like an extra delegate.
It's also just not obvious what AZs are.
Yeah, you kind of have to look elsewhere to know what's that. So let me just type this up. Oh, in fact, I can do this here. Okay.
I mean, does Marshall really make sense for any of this stuff?
So the reason we landed on Marshall is because it's a low-level API and we didn't feel like adding another type for that. I think originally it was a separate type. Originally we had like I think it was called load library or whatever, but then
we had a native library type.
And then it actually was a stateful type too. I think they were originally like instance members and you would dispose them. And we basically all said we don't want to do that because that makes it appear safer than it actually is.
We didn't want the disposable context, but like everything else on Marshall is about an object. Like every single member on Marshall is about an object, and none of these are about an object at all.
You say that, but is that actually true? I mean, there's plenty of like helper methods.
The closest thing that I see that's not about an object is get type, but it's get type about column ID, but it's pointers to string, pointers to structure, reading from an object is another type. It's all about how you take a thing and you rewrite it while you're doing a p invoke is what Marshall's for.
Well, yeah, you think of Marshall as utility functions for p invoke, then I would argue these methods clearly make sense, right?
Yeah, like just scanning the list, everything here looks like it's about how to manipulate an object, and this is about how to manipulate your process space. And
I mean, other places where this could go, assembly load context.
I'm asking the question. I'm not objecting strongly.
Didn't we? Wasn't the original proposal to have a native Marshall class that all of these would sit on? Though it would only have a few APIs.
Library class.
What was that again? You're breaking up.
The original proposal was a native library class. with all of these methods.
Yes, but I thought that one of the intermediate proposals I thought was to have a native Marshall class that would contain pinvoke specific functionality like this. Maybe it just wouldn't be interesting enough to have a class with so few members.
Yeah, reading through the notes, it doesn't seem to capture that part.
Okay.
But I think I mean, it is a fair question, right? What would you call it, though? Native Marshall? Seems weird, because, I mean, everything on Marshall is native.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say Library Marshall, maybe, but...
Marshall's not the end of the world, especially since there are that many APIs being added.
The only one that I could imagine was maybe it's just native library. Native library.load, native library.try-load, native library.free, native library.get export. Might not be horrible, right? Because my other concern is that if you put these types on Marshall, they are like spread out because they don't have a common prefix, so you basically have to, like, they don't show up like here where you have logical equivalence. So it's a bit harder to discover what the fuck you're supposed to do with these things.
That's a fair point.
And again, like, given that I think it would still go into in interop services where, I mean, it would be nice if the namespace would be cleaner, but that's not a problem we have right now. it's a grab bag. So
can you go back to the other?
Sorry.
The top part?
Interop services isn't the worst namespace in the world.
Yeah, depending on your, I mean, system is worse. I give you that.
Well, considering the scenario.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't think, I mean, if it would be super clean, it's a bit more concerning to add a type to it, but given there are already like plenty of types in there, I think making that a separate type might actually be better.
So if this was native, if it was on a static class called native library and it was load, try load, unload, and get and try get export, those make sense. I would say maybe there should be safe handle instead of event pointers so that you get type safety on these things. But with safe handle, that means that we expect that there's a dispose on it, and we don't want people to dispose them.
Yeah, I think we decided specifically against them for.
Indeed. Yeah. It's really, I don't remember why we would. I thought that we discussed not having the free library.
Well, the original proposal that I was working on a year or so ago. There was an actual handle, but the handle was not a safe handle and it was not iDisposable. Like, once it was brought into the process, you're done. It's loaded forever.
But essentially typed it better.
Yeah. Well, so that we could have instance methods hanging off of it.
And then, let me just add this guy here.
I mean, it's nice when the type of an argument helps you understand. Which kind of input are you supposed to pass into get library export?
Remind me, does get library export perform name mangling?
I don't think so.
Okay. Okay.
I mean,
no.
It's transparently be get proc address, so whatever get proc address does.
So not exactly equivalent to DLL 1.1.
Yeah, it's just a syntax of the API.
Okay, that's fine.
So the reason I'm typing furiously is because I'm trying to contain the nodes.
So I'm not sure if there's a consensus on where it is going.
Yeah. I think it's
native library.
System, runtime, interop services, and then make a new static class called native library.
Yeah.
All of these APIs go as it.
And then that would also, I would then also move the, what Emo just did.
We can always make that class a safe handle later on if we wanted to. There's nothing stopping us from doing that.
Making native libraries or something?
Yeah, I mean, you can go from a static class to a non-static class without being a break and change.
Right, but the load returning init pointer, then we would have like, okay, what we want you to do is call load and then call the constructor at like.
We could watch that.
Yeah.
So does this capture roughly what we are? So what are the names here?
I would rename Frida on like.
So library path, I think. Bring library path. If we could just get it from
unload.
other APIs.
So it's this one here, right? It's the name one or the path one? Oh, it's the name one, right?
Library path, assembly, and search path.
No, library name, right? Because it gets the exact thing which is in the DL import.
Yes, right.
It's definitely not a path.
I mean, it could be.
It can be a path, but typically it won't be a path.
Yeah, and I think also we probably should keep the order from here, right? Which was name, assembly, and then path, not the other way around, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Because this one swaps these two things. And then is the path nullable or not? Probably not.
So that is nullable, yes. That's an enum.
It's nullable, yeah.
But is it an enum in the callback?
In the callback, do you get pass now ever? I don't think so, right?
It's going to be
that
null
would mean
if
default, right?
Yeah, it's going to be null if the p invoke does not have a DLL search path attribute.
I mean, you could always get it from the assembly.
The order is that you first look at the p invoke. If it's not there, then you look at the assembly.
Yes, but you could already do that lookup by the time this DLL gets invoked.
I mean, you can look at the assembly and then get it.
Well, you can look up the assembly. You cannot look up the DL import attribute, and also
no, but I mean,
it can be called from the load.
At the call site, someone has or has not specified a DLL import search path. By the time this makes its way through the system to the point where to the point where the event itself is being invoked, like presumably the DLL import search path has already been resolved as if someone hasn't given me anything, just pull it off the assembly. Right?
So
yes, that's true.
So non-nullable in the callback.
Yeah, that's what I was just heard.
Right, but it could be null if it's not there in both places, right? So I think it should still be nullable in that sense.
Well, the problem is though that is the thing you give the user, right? So I would say that probably we should do the work to determine if somebody didn't specify.
I think we will do the work. The question is what happens if there's no attribute anywhere, like DL import or assembly.
What happens if there's no attribute anywhere? Presumably we have a behavior, and presumably that matches the name of one of the values to DLL import search path. And if not, we should just add that enum value of do that extra magic thing. So.
Okay.
Actually, the default value is legacy behavior, and it has a very different meaning.
Yeah.
So that's why it was nullable in the first place.
Okay.
And we're like,
that wasn't the reason it was nullable in the first place. The reason it was nullable in the first place is because it might not be specified, and if it's not specified, you want to fall back to the assembly. Because you don't want to override what's on the assembly if it's not specified.
Yeah.
What are the enum values? There's not a default.
No, it's borderline horrible, I think. Both said DL search path. What? No. DL import search path. The imports.
Yeah, there's legacy behavior.
Legacy behavior.
Is legacy behavior not the legacy behavior that null would give you?
I mean, legacy behavior I heard is
yeah, we have a whole bunch of
basically legacy behavior passes the loaded order search. It's actually not always required, and I've heard that it has some security implications, and that's why we wouldn't default to legacy behavior.
Okay.
Well, I mean, like, this is if we have this delegate type, and we have this set resolver, and we say that it should be nullable, we have to tell someone what to do if it's null.
Right.
And if the thing is, do what you would do if they were given the value legacy behavior, then we should make it non-nullable, and we should just pass legacy behavior. But if the null and legacy are different, then we need to describe that somewhere.
And would it be simpler to add an enum value?
Right, and that's my comments on add do the weird extra magic thing. Like we should get rid of the question mark. I think we should get rid of the question mark no matter what. And if we need to add a new value of do magic, then we should name do magic and add it.
I think it's not simple to add a flag to that DL import search because first of all, I don't know who owns it. Second of all, it actually sort of sits on top of another enum that is passed to load library. So if you look at the values, they're like not linear because they actually overlap with the load library flags, and they're carefully crafted so that they use only certain bits. In fact, that assembly directly has a value too, because that has special meaning to load library, and it's never used. Both of them cannot occur the same way. So there are no more bits in that enum, as far as I can tell. So that's why we have this identify whether there's attribute or not.
I am a bit confused now.
So just to clarify, if I don't have a DLL import search path, assume I have no DLL import search path attribute on the assembly. Assume I have a pinvoke that has DLL import search path legacy behavior. Does that behave differently than a pinvoke that has no DLL import search path attribute at all? Assuming that the assembly does not specify one.
I think if it's not present, then it makes a call without this load with altered search path flag. And if it is present, it adds this load with altered search path flag. That's the only difference.
So in short, we don't know. We'll have to find out.
Because since the value of legacy behavior is 0, it seems to, I mean, I would guess that it really means you didn't have an opinion, so I'm going to do the thing that we used to do, which means that we don't need a nullable because that's what 0 means.
I mean, I said basically if the legacy behavior enum is present, then the load library EX function is called with load with altered search paths flag. Otherwise, this is just called without the load with altered search paths flags. That's the difference.
But do we know what's the difference in terms of behavior? Right, like you're describing how it's implemented, but the behavior differences we probably don't know.
What is the difference between load with altered search path flag?
Sure, but what does it do, right? Do we know that right now?
Load with altered search path flag means basically it appends the. It looks at the current directory before the whatever the default search path. There's a way to set the search paths. There's some API to set the search paths, and this one actually uses those search paths before the whatever default search paths the load library uses. There could be more to it. I don't know exactly, but this is my understanding.
Okay.
So what you're saying is that if there's no attribute anywhere, you will get a behavior which is not described by any of the enums, right?
Yes, that's my understanding. Yeah.
Maybe we can double check that, and if that's true, then we would make it nullable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the summary? So we will investigate whether we can add an enum, and if that's not the case, we make it nullable.
No, it's whether the state where we would pass null or the state where we would pass 0 are actually different, and if they are, then we need the question mark, and if they're not, we don't.
Yep. Okay. Sounds good.
Okay.
And then no one will ever be able to write this.
All right, so let me just paste all of this in. And then everybody agrees with these notes? Modulo the tempos.
The open item only applies to the callback. It doesn't apply to the
fair enough, yeah, that's what I thought. The open item needs
because in try load it means fall back to whatever the assembly says. Yeah. But in the actually resolve, it's do we need to convey the semantic difference?
Yes. that is fair. All right, I did that. Then I bounce it back to API needs work, because you guys need to figure out what to do there. And then once you're ready with that, then we're done with that.
Okay.
All right, so I hate to do that to you, but maybe if that's contentious, we should just do the exception first, because you have the compiler guys right now here, and it seems pretty simple to just agree on that thing.
Is
Okay.
Neil on the call?
So Neil is also on the call, yes.
Perfect.
So for some summary, so the way I understand it is this is the exception that you guys will throw when the developer writes a pattern matching, but he didn't handle all the cases, correct?
Right. So you write a.
That's correct.
Oh, go ahead, Neil.
Yeah. Okay. That's almost correct. For example, this particular example in the summary will throw because the particular input that was passed was not handled. If the particular input is handled, of course, it won't throw simply because it doesn't handle some other case.
Right.
It's only if the particular input is not actually handled by one of the cases, then the exception would be thrown.
Right.
This code would get a warning at compile time, by the way, saying this switch doesn't handle all the cases.
And what's the down level behavior? Since this is a language feature, like, is this a required type to use the language feature, or?
No. If the platform that you compile against does not have this exception, it will throw invalid operation exception, which is the base type.
Yes. So that's a similar concern that I raised, that I said it seems like a source breaking change, you upgrade it and you throw a different exception. But the idea is that the down level behavior is basically a subset of the new behavior, in the sense that we throw platform not so we throw invalid operation exception. So if you have down level
if you depend on it throwing invalid operation exception, and you catch it, for example, you'll still catch match failure exception because it's a subtype.
Yep.
It's only if you test for the precise type of what's thrown would it be a breaking change.
Because the problem I'm just thinking here of, you're a library that understands the real thing. Like, this is, I know that we're analyzing the feature instead of the type here, but if a library that is compiling against the latest set of reference assemblies catches match failure exception, but they depend on a library that used a lower targeting version, that library threw invalid operation exception and broke the contract of the feature. So I still think the feature
sorry, if you're using a low-level library, that low-level library will have a contract of what exceptions it should throw.
Yeah, I don't think this is a kind of exception that you're likely to find in contracts.
Okay.
For example, I don't think it makes sense for a library to depend on a library throwing argument exception. It just doesn't make sense, or null reference exception. These are basically failure. It's a kind of failure of the program that you want diagnosed at runtime.
Fair enough. As long if we think that it's a non-catch, like that it's not a contract exception.
Well, you raise a good point. It's like you basically have the backwards compatibility or the forwards compatibility issue, right? Where newer code consumes an older library, right? It's still unfortunate. But I think in practice, I agree with Neil that you shouldn't depend on this, but in practice, people do depend on this, right? I think
people depend on everything.
That's the unfortunate.
That's fine. The problem is, let's say you're depending on a low-level library that did not have the new type, so it's okay. So you're saying your catch is catch of invalid operation exception, and that works.
Yeah, well, it's
because the low-level library used to throw that type. But then the low-level library upgrades, and you're still catching it. Maybe can you explain this?
It's the other way. It's because maybe you were both targeting out of Net Standard 2.0, and now you're taking your library, which is calling into another library, and you've upgraded to Net Standard 2.1. You see this exception. You see that's actually what's being thrown when you hit it in your case. You're like, oh, this is a more descriptive exception. I'm changing my catch instead of adding a new catch to catch this one, because that's what the feature does now. Except this other library, because it targeted an older net standard, what the compiler injected was the invalid operation exception and not the match.
Right. How do you know that old library would throw one exception or another?
Well, the case that you end up with is when you tested it, you were getting a newer version of the library. And
so you're assuming the implementation of that library is using a switch expression, and you're relying on that implementation, as opposed to relying on a contract where they say, okay, here are the exceptions we could throw for some scenarios. It seems very like you know the internals of that library is.
Well, it's more like people write code. The code blows up with an exception. They add a handler for it, and then they tested that, they ship that, right? I mean, like in practice in .NET, people are not really good with documenting exceptions.
Explain the scenario where if a person who does that does not run into problems in my.
No, let's say I ship a library that targets .NET Core 3.0 today, right? Mm-hmm. I write the switch statement, and then you guys emit the call for this new exception, right? Then I have a bunch of customers pushing back on my library and say, well, can you please support .NET Core 2.0? And I say,
so it's a library that downgrades their...
Which is valid, right? Because, I mean, previously I was consumable from 3.0. I still consume from 3.0. My own features that doesn't require any 3.0 features, I just recompile my source code, and now my caller is broken, right? Yeah.
That, I think is a valid scenario.
Yeah, but I think the question is how much
you extend your support towards a lower level platforms.
The other case would be if the middle library that you're depending on, if it's multi-targeted, and you've tested it only using the 3.0 runtime.
Right.
You always saw a match failure exception. That's the catch you wrote. But then when you send it to a customer, they have a NuGet binding that pulls it to the other cross-target or the previous version of the library, and it now gets because that middle library, because the compiler had to change what it wrote because it's depending on an exception that doesn't exist. Like I think it creates for a very weird upgrade. Like this is the good old you need something to have existed for 10 years before you can depend on it in the compiler problem. So. Well,
I think set a breakpoint and see what's going on, right?
Well, I mean, then at that point, does it even need to be a public exception type or something that the compiler just omits as it's into each assembly that's going to throw it from? But the yeah,
I would catch it. I would catch it in temporary code while I'm debugging my application.
Yeah, and you could catch the invalid operation exception, and then use the debugger view to see that it's a match failure exception, which is a private class inside or a class.
So this is guessing the compiler generates this implementation.
If you find the type, you use it. If you don't find the type, you omit the type.
It's still weird.
If we never plan to have that type in libraries,
so then, as far as being a thing called system.matchFailure exception, that feels like a name that people are going to start.
Hold on. So before talking about the name, can we stick on the point of should we have the type at all, or should the compiler just emit it?
Getting the implementation right is sometimes subtle. Like we implement get object data with the security critical attribute, and I mean it's, then the compiler depends on streaming context and serialization info.
Yeah.
Like these are all things that we don't want the compiler to have to know about, and suddenly the compiler has to know about all this stuff.
I would say like emitting types makes sense for me for like marker attributes or something that are effectively policy free, right? Like for things like this where you generate a fuck ton of code that you want to be able to fix at some point or like evolve. I don't think that's super clean. I agree with that.
Detail that the compiler emitted as part of building. It doesn't sound like an API feature.
You are not wrong, but at the same time, like how would you build that otherwise? Basically, the only way for the compiler to give you the developer experience that we want, we would have to.
If you don't catch it, it prints match failure exception. What match failure exception? Well, who cares? It came from nowhere. Like it's global : match failure exception. It just generated it into your assembly as an internal class.
To be fair, when I say debugging, I mean both like literally F5ing your box as well as you have an application deployed on a server, and the only thing you have is a catch all enter that logs, right? So at which point the text of the exception message is interesting, right? So you can't just
and that's fine. The compiler wrote it down. It's there. It's like having a static CS file that they have to write it as a resource and just inject it in the stream every time.
Is there an option to put this type in the BCL, but not make it public? Would that help us? The compiler could still reference it.
Honestly, at this point, I would honestly say like the down level scenario or the scenario where you have a breaking change is so remote that I'm also willing to say, you know, you have to change your code. Like I think that's like it's not .NET Framework way. I mean, the thing that scares me the most from .NET Framework is an in-place update scenario, right? But this is not an in-place update scenario failure even for .NET Framework because you have to recompile. At which point my care level is already from like here to here. And then the next thing is like even in that scenario, like how likely you're being affected, but it's not very likely. And I think it's much cleaner to have a public API that we can document, that is in docs, that is in reference assemblies, that has a behavior, and that's the compiler depending on. Now the alternative is also we could just say the compiler doesn't allow you to use pattern matching when you don't have that exception type, but that seems also overly restrictive, which I'm also not a fan of. So I'd rather say, yep, you have that, and there's this additional caveat that if you depend on that exception type, you're busted. But that seems to me fair. I don't know.
So, yeah. So if we assume that we're adding it, I would move it to compiler services. If the belief is no one should be catching this in practice, then we don't care what namespace it's in. You're never going to write it, and by having it a system match failure exception, it sounds like a general exception that people are supposed to work off of, which defeats the notion that this feature is throwing it as a you should never.
That one I would agree with, yes, because I mean realistically the only thing the developer cares about is the result of toString, right? Which is really the only. So like, would you ever expect code to access unmatched value? Probably not. And if anybody ever wants that, I mean they can discover the exception type. In the debugger, and then basically just look it up themselves.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the toString will tell you system runtime.compiler services .match failure exception. And you're like, oh, there's a thing here. Maybe I can catch it.
Neil, does that sound okay to you? Changing the namespace?
Yeah, changing the namespace is fine.
Sounds good.
But because that makes it more clear. Like this is a niche thing. You shouldn't be throwing this in your own code. This is just part of a compiler feature, and then if we get people who are depending on it, it's like, really, you're catching an exception code out of compiler services?
We should also have probably put null reference exception in compiler services too, shouldn't we?
Oh, there's another. Sorry, there's another option.
No, I'm serious. I'm serious. I mean, obviously we can't change it at this point, but whatever logic causes us to put this in compiler services should also cause us to put null reference exception in compiler services. You don't throw it, you don't catch it, but it is something that you expect to look at and understand as part of your program. It's part of the language, it's part of the programming model. It's not something that's sort of hidden away that only the compiler services is for things where the compiler is talking to itself. It's for things where the compiler generates and the compiler consumes, and no one should ever see it. This is something that people see. It's something that people should. I mean, it's a kind of failure in your source code that arises in your source code, and you are going to see the failure, and it's meaningful to people. It's not just the compiler talking to itself.
Yeah, I just think that we get like there's like system data invalid data exception, and because I feel like system data is in the default template of some version of VS, and you get people who start writing. Throw new and then IntelliSense, like start writing the word data, like fishing for exceptions that sound right. And they're like, oh yeah, like invalid data exception. It's like, well, no, that exception has a very specific contract that you violated. And in system, match failure exception sounds like, oh, it sounds exactly the same as like key not found exception. So like, sure, I'll throw this. It's newer. It must be better. So I'm just concerned that the combination of a general purpose sound like match failure. I know that's specific to a compiler feature, but it's not specific to a developer writing a throw statement. So either it needs a very more complicated name or to move to a namespace that's not a default namespace.
Well, which it is, right? So
there might be a way out that might resolve both the previous problem and this problem. What if we mark this type as obsolete right out of the gate? So you cannot.
But why?
So you can.
Why?
It's not designed to.
Would we do this? Why don't we mark null reference exception obsolete?
You can catch it.
And you can catch this too.
The idea is that
it's in exactly the same state as null reference exception.
If we make it obsolete, we say that's not the recommended usage. The recommended usage is you catch the base type if you wanted to catch it.
I don't believe that.
Then you would not let the feature work on targeting versions that didn't have the exception.
I'm sorry, I don't believe that. The main reason you would catch it is while you're debugging your code.
Right.
But it shouldn't be obsolete. It shouldn't give me any kind of diagnostic when I insert code to catch it for debugging purposes. It's just like null reference exception. There's nothing wrong with catching null reference exception. I would be very suspicious of production code that does that, but I've written catch null reference exception in my code so I can figure out what's going on.
I need to take a shower now, I think, but
hey, MVC ships with that in production code, catch null reference exception.
Now I need more than a shower.
Sure, there is, yeah.
I mean, the other question, I mean, like, I think this was also raised by Dan, that match failure sounds very, like, maybe too generic, and, like, basically it begs the question whether it would work for regex as well. Can we include the name pattern somewhere? Like, I don't know, pattern match or unmatched pattern or something like that? Like, makes it a bit more specific for what it is. Like, I think I suggested, like,
switch
pattern
expression failure exception.
That works for me. Switch expression.
Yeah. Again, my concern is just that if it's in the namespace system and it has a generally applicable sounding name.
Yeah.
So as long as we solve one of those two, my concern goes down.
Would you like to, is there any other expression failure or switch expression failure that you would like to use this for? Could we just call it switch expression exception? You should never have this error at least once, right? We should have less.
It wasn't clear to me whether we're going to move the namespace as well.
Yeah, I would.
Did we settle on that?
I would still do that. I mean, like, it basically is not something we expect people to use. I mean, system is kind of already like a mess, so we should not add to that. And if we don't expect people to use this type frequently, then I wouldn't add it to system. And compiler services is usually used for APIs that they are public, they have to be public, but we really don't expect anybody to, like, ever do something with it. The other question is, should we seal the type?
Unsealing is not a breaking change. Sealing is.
Right.
And Christoph's not here, so...
He cannot say no to it. Yeah, that's true. I think attributes we generally try to seal, and I think even exceptions, I think you want to think about the hierarchy. You don't want to deal with other people inheriting your...
I have one more question, which is a little bit between the language and the exception. There's a scenario where you do a switch on a single value, and there's also a switch where you're allowed to pattern match basically multiple values as a block. Neil, I know we discussed that, and at least for now, we're saying we're rejecting the multi-value scenario where we're not going to attempt to capture the values that cause the problem.
The specification does not. I don't think the specification should say anything about the situations in which the value is or is not captured as an unmatched value. In fact, I think we may want to change the criteria. For example, we might want to say that it's never captured and released and always captured and debugged, whatever that means. We might choose to do that. I think that would be a change. I think the documentation here is at the level that it is fine. They'll give us some flexibility.
I'm not talking about the documentation so much as in practice. Are we going to capture multi-values or not?
It depends. It depends on whether the multiple values are needed for the switch expression.
So you're doing a switch expression on A comma B.
Right. If you have a case var x, then yes, it will be captured because case var x requires the thing to be constructed. So in the failure case, let's say it's when false. In the failure case, it will be captured.
Sorry, what is captured? It would be the A and B, right? Those are the values that you did not, or you handled, or you did not handle, right?
No, that's a tuple expression. It's one value.
Sorry, you can't. Isn't there a? Oh, you're saying the switch is ever only applied to a single value?
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
So the only thing I would say is like what Neil just said. Like we should feel free to like not write the value in debug mode. I think I'm fine with having that, but I would give people an assembly level way to override this because there's plenty of people like Stack Overflow that basically want to have full fidelity for logging of production code, and I think they may not like the fact that you have no way of doing that without like making the whole thing debug build.
Yeah, but there's also a risk that you're going to capture user data.
That's true. Although, like, I think if you have a web server and you release if you release your exception to the public in a web server, like you already like.
And think about imagine we hit this inside Rosetta and we get a Watson report that's and our first question is going to be what value did we not handle?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
So unless there's like a big saving, the privacy aspect is I think general to any exceptions. It's not new here.
No, I think we actually had this discussion like I think 2 years ago on ScoreFX. Any information on an exception, including the message, is something you should never disclose unless you have access to the box.
Right.
So I would argue both in debug and release mode we should capture values.
I mean, I think you should probably like I think my only feedback would be don't try to separate release from debug. But I mean, there will be cases where you can capture the value, so it's kind of a best effort thing. So. Like as you said, like if it's a ref struct, you can, right? So like there's cases where it's just not possible. But
what will the behavior be in that case?
I'm not prepared to decide at this point in time what are the precise conditions on which it will or will not capture an unmatched value.
Right.
We have something in the implementation right now.
Yes.
What the implementation right now does is if the input value can be convertible to object, and it was not a tuple expression that was not needed as a whole, then it's captured. Otherwise, it isn't. I'm perfectly fine adjusting those, especially on the basis of actual user feedback. It doesn't depend on release or debug right now, but I'm also open to having it depend on release and debug. We've sat down and discussed this in 3 different forums and come to have different leanings at different times, and I just don't want to do that again.
Yeah,
I want to focus on getting the API in.
I think that's fair. Like I think I think my only problem would be if you have different rules for debug and release, it gets hard, right? Like if it's the same. If the same kind of code compiled for debug and release has the same behavior, no matter what tricky that is, I think people can at least reason about that.
Yeah, I think the only real question for multi-match was, do you need a different property for the multi-match? And if your answer is no, then that's fine.
Yeah.
Right. Multi-match is not a thing in the language.
Okay.
The switch expression, the left hand, the input expression is to the left of the switch. It's not part of the switch syntax. It's just whatever expression it is. There's no special multi-switch.
Oh,
it's just whatever expression happens to be there.
Right. Yes.
Yep.
The switch statement is a different thing altogether.
Right.
Switch statements can't fail.
I will be the truth, though.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Then
I think it's too late, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know. All right. So then let's do this, and then say API approved. All right.
Awesome.
We approve things?
Every once in a while, yes. So back to VTech. So
thank you very much. I'm gonna head out.
Still on? I thought we were done with that.
I was thinking the exception was.
That's okay. Although I must admit I have only 30 minutes, then I will absolutely have to leave. So.
That's good. So then get to a conclusion in 10 minutes.
Hopefully. So this is a new thing. Basically, what this is trying to solve is the fact that in .NET Core there's no API which would let the app invoke the same resolution mechanism for assemblies as we do during startup, which is all the glorious logic around depth.json parsing and resolution and all of that. And basically, this makes it really hard to do any kind of plugin loads where the plugin has meaningful dependencies. And so, what the proposal is to add a new mechanism, new API, which would let you point the code to the plugin or the DLL or the component which you want to load, and the thing would look next to it where it has a depth.json file, and if it does, then it would parse it and it would apply the same rules as if it was loaded, or almost as if it was loaded during startup.
I see.
And the way it exposes the information, rather than providing a full-blown object model, which is what we do in the Microsoft Extension Dependency Model DLL, which we already shipped as a NuGet. It's just answers the questions related to resolving. So resolve manage, and it only resolves the file. It doesn't actually load anything.
So, and the reason this is a class that you instantiate is because you're holding on to the result of the parse JSON, I suppose?
Yeah, internally it stores the results of the parsing and resolution, and then it just answers questions. So the actual work happens during the constructor. The resolve methods are effectively just lookups.
But would that better be served as a singleton?
Like you can have multiple of those, right?
If you want to defer the work, well, because is the string of the path there going to mean that each constructor possibly is hitting a different JSON, or are they all using the same JSON?
Yes, different. So you point it to plugin, right?
And it is
through the constructor parameter, and it will load that plugin with all its.
Should there be an
And
accelerator?
it's called component because it's not just plugins, right? It could be like dependency injection, all of those kind of things.
Right.
So I explicitly didn't want it to call it plugin, even though people typically think about it as plugins.
Yeah, since I've never actually even seen one of these depth.json files. I don't.
Yeah.
I didn't know there's more than one. Should there be an accelerator for getting the one that corresponds to the entry point?
So that's a tricky thing to do. So in theory, the one which is used to start the app is kind of inherently part of the default load context. And so you can sort of get to it by asking questions on the default load context.
Yeah, but that makes
But it doesn't have the ability to give you paths, at least not right now.
So would we...
so what we were thinking about is that maybe there would be a way to get an instance of this class as a property on the default load context.
Yep.
And that would basically do that.
Sure, whether it's a property hanging off default load context or it's a static off of here to get the one corresponding to. But yeah, my question is looking at this of if a thing that someone would want to do is say, well, I want the thing that would happen if I added this word in main, then how hard is that for them to do? And the normal
the problem is that so this class only talks about files.
Yeah.
when you call assembly.load on the default load context, there's way more things which can happen, not just files. You can maybe potentially load from memory, and there's a bunch of events which are triggered during the resolution process, which can customize the behavior. This class doesn't handle any of it, and it's intentional. This is basically a building block. This is actually, it's kind of the other way around. This is intended to be used by when you implement one of the events in either default load context or custom load context to actually get like the desired behavior.
Okay.
So actually, the reason I was thinking this is contentious is first the class name, which I mean, I don't know whether that's something which we like. And the second one is that the other idea is that this is API which currently makes sense only on .NET Core. We can't really, like on Mono, you can't really implement it today, or at least not the same way. It would have to be very different implementation. And I don't know whether the same constructor would even work on Mono.
So, so that's because you don't have this asset.json thingy on Mono, right?
Yes.
What about assembly?
But I mean, you can also think about it on like the desktop framework, where we also don't have it, but there's like binding redirection configs and the fusion logic, which in theory could implement something like this, right?
I see.
And so the other thinking which I had, and I just, again don't know, is maybe we should have a interface or abstract base class with just the two methods, the resolve methods, and then a concrete implementation which is based on the .NET Core rules, which is deps.json and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. Like, it would just mean that it's part of .NET Core Apps API surface, and we wouldn't ever promote it to standard or anything.
Right. I mean, I think, yeah, so it's not that I mind the abstraction. I just think, like, in order to design an abstraction, you really want two implementations. Like, if you only have one implementation, then it seems like you might be unhappy with the abstraction you end up building, because once you actually do it on Mono, you try to implement it, you might find that the abstraction shape you have is not the one you wanted.
The other approach is that we can approve it the way it is, and because we'll be doing a lot of work and prototyping around this throughout the .NET Core 3.0 schedule. And so if we hit something where it warrants more abstraction, we can revisit this.
Right. Yeah. The thing is, the way, as far as the name goes, I mean, given that you put in the loader namespace, I think it's probably fine to use that name. I mean, component or, resolver or, the assembly, like, these things are all, like, so overused in .NET that it's not really clear what any of these are. But, I mean, one other design point that you might want to consider is, instead of having this thing where the asset file is implicit, like, just have a type that basically allows you to parse the JSON file. Right? You just basically instantiate this guy pointing to a stream or a path of the JSON file, and then you answer the question in the context of that.
I'm
so
skeptical of that. Does that mean, like, if in 4.0 the new hotness is some other file format, and we change the file format, we don't want it to say, like, give me the JSON path. It's like, tell me the assembly, and we know how to load a dependency model for it. So I would leave it.
So we're actually already in that situation, because today it's completely valid to not have the deps.json file, even for the app during startup. And there's a behavior by, like, searching the current directory kind of thing.
I see.
And so this will implement the exact same thing. So if the assembly doesn't have a deps.json file next to it, it will do the local search, basically.
I see.
So did you want to mention the requirement of host policy present at the point?
Yeah, so right now what we plan to implement it with is by calling into the host policy DL, which is a native component. What that means is that if you happen to use this on a runtime which is hosted through custom hosts which don't use host policy, then this will not work. And it will throw in the constructor. There is a way to make it work everywhere, but we would have to introduce new interfaces on the hosting side so that the custom host can implement this functionality.
What's the scenario for different hosts or for different not using host policy?
Custom hosts are a scenario which we publicly support and is documented. I'm not personally aware of any good example where it's used, but well, yes, you can say Koran. Koran is one like that.
Yeah. So
the reason it's kind of the reason it makes sense to make it host specific is that the deps.json thing that during startup is actually specific to the host policy hosting.
Right.
For example, Koran doesn't have any of that, and it uses different logic to resolve dependencies. And so it would make sense for it to implement this functionality differently.
So, but basically what it just means is it's not a problem of this abstraction, right? It's just basically, if you will, a problem in the extension points that our hosting APIs have, right? I mean, you could just say in order to have a host that works, the host has to effectively answer these two questions meaningfully.
Yes.
And then, they do it whatever mechanism they see fit. If they don't parse a JSON file, if they just, use a magic 8-ball to do that, then that's fine, as long as they give answers back.
And we don't have
in a way, it's a point-in-time thing where what I'm saying is currently we don't plan to expose host book to be able for the custom host to make this work.
Which is reasonable the same way with Mono, right? You don't want to build abstraction until you know what you're building for.
Yeah.
So.
While it's good to know that you currently have that limitation, I don't think unless you think it would change the structure of the managed side here. Sounds like
I don't think it will.
That would be a bug level thing, and I'd wait until someone reported it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you really think you will have many hosts that don't have that, I would probably just expose a capability API somewhere, like a static that says, can you actually use component resolvers or not? The only other suggestion that I have, instead of calling it component dependency resolver, you might want to call it assembly dependency resolver, because given that you basically start with an assembly.
We can call it Fusion.
Sorry, what?
We can call it Fusion.
Man,
okay.
Cross-platform Fusion, X Fusion.
Oh, I love it.
Actually, look at this. I'm already prepared.
Ooh. Isn't that blueberry flavor?
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I suggest assembly as opposed to component is that it seems a little bit less overloaded. And you basically resolve dependencies of an assembly. But,
how would you name it again? Assembly
dependency resolver.
Assembly dependency resolver. Yeah.
Because it does resolve the dependencies of a. It's zero assembly.
Yeah.
It's a bit the reason. There's a nuance to it, which is that you can have a component which consists of multiple assemblies.
Exactly.
And in this case, this API requires you to point to the main one, the one which has the deps.json next to it, right? Whether if we call it assembly, it might kind of give a feeling that you can point it to any one of those and it will kind of work, which it won't.
I see what you're saying.
But I don't see that as a big hurdle. Honestly.
On the other hand,
I would be fine if you decide to call it assembly dependency resolver.
Yeah. We're basically creating a new term, component, which we don't have right now in this context, right?
Right. That's the only reason I suggested anything because component is so ill-defined. It's what does it even mean?
You could use the keyword context or something.
Sorry, what was that? Context?
Yeah, just because it tends to work with assembly load context, I was wondering if it was a context dependency resolver might make sense. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it can also resolve native libraries, right? Not just assemblies.
No, but you're resolving dependencies of a given assembly, right? And that's always true in this case. So that's why assembly dependency resolver actually makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's a managed or unmanaged dependency doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Dependencies of the assembly.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm fine with it. I mean, with the caveat that you cannot just point it to a random assembly, it will probably not work right, but that's okay. This is meant to be a low-level API, and you probably will need to read docs to use it fully. So.
We like Fusion docs.
just add this. The only caveat is that you need to pass the path to the assembly that has the what's it called? Runtime.json. What is this JSON file called?
It's it has the same name as the assembly, and the extension is .deps.json.
I see.
So everywhere we just say deps like .deps.json file without specifying the name.
Yeah. All right. Right, that seems to be roughly where we are right now.
That sounds nice.
All right, then let me just comment on this. Let me prove this as is, and then you have something to think about whether you want to do this or not.
Can you scroll down to the names again, please?
Absolutely.
Trying to think about the resolve assembly to path.
The MNHDL is to match the naming of the related functions on assembly load context.
Now that we rename it to assembly dependency resolver, the resolve assembly to path. Yeah.
Well, is the differentiate between
that's the managed one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand that, but yeah, okay, I'll shut up. The to path is a bit weird, but actually, yeah, that's what you're getting. Okay.
Good. So only thing we absolutely have to do the concept was indicator if we code incorrectly, like set assumption incorrect way, or you initial estimate, or you posted whatever. Usually, again, it's the one that's the more problematic. It is really good to have here. I would just make it better and better and call it a day. guess I don't know how it ends up being iStream somewhere in the middle at that point, and we have iStream to stream that for somewhere. Yeah, I think honestly, expand with this side, right? Because you basically like basically what then you actually do copy. And the other option is the other option, which is that's what I would say.
only people who would ever incur changes are people who either already subclass this type and according to API that's 0% of the entire population that we have paid for. The other people who would be broken are people who are calling the existing unsafe methods. You can see the ones that are called methods. Again, every single one of those methods have zero usage as far as I can tell. Because it literally takes years. It tells you whether or not this has to be done. In particular, the logic actually changed over time, so because you can see those everybody do that, but this is not the case. So really this comes down to like, can we start breaking changes for things that have zero usage for things that if we make changes, what I would do literally is mark this entire tab as obsolete and bring up a new one.
And so effectively it will do the same thing except for these people to be able to do this, but it's
not necessarily, because if you look in the middleware to virtual methods, some of those methods already exist, some don't exist today. The ones that are for operations stats, for instance, don't exist today. Those will exist on the new type of module too. The family don't exist at all. We really not touch it. The brain as it is like completely unsafe subclass. The types do have usage, like specifically the code types have usage. The gates problem uses them, for instance. These types were originally part of gates before they got called cortex. I would very much prefer the abstract class entirely as that. But I'm using that in real estate as well. The reason for that, on the abstract class, it has a default reference structure. There are 3 subclasses of this: HTML code, URL code, JavaScript, framework. All 3 of those are also abstract, but those 3 types also have factors that will let you prove them, and give you back an internal implementation. Originally, when this was originally on ASP.NET, there was no base class common to all 3 cover types. All 3 cover types were themselves concrete classes, not abstract, that simply implemented interfaces, HTML or URL code and so on. And if you wanted to replace the implementation, you would just create your own encoder and implement the interface, and then pass that interface through an ASP.NET system. The reason it was done that way is, say that you're creating a component that requires an HTML code input. You are design by that generally say, take the derived or take the base class that is common to basically everything in Sun, which is why you would never take streamless implementation in your APIs if you were creating an engineer. But if you need something that performs HTML encoding, like what we really want to tell you is you can't specify architecture here, like you have to provide something that specifically implements the contract for HTML encoding. The contracts for all 3 codings look the same because it's all just text transform the vendors, but they wanted to be very easy as to operations being performed.
That's